Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing well. Now we are at the point in time where we are going to be discussing the making of fabrics. We've done all of the different fibers, we've classified them. Last week we were focused on yarn production, and so now it's going to all come together into fabrics. And there are two ways in which to take the yarns into fabrics, and that's by either weaving or knitting. So this week we're going to be talking about weaving, and then next week we're going to get into knitting. So the two chapters that are the focus of this week are chapters 12 and 13. Here's a chart that basically just gives you a visual so you can see the different types of fabric construction. And again, we're going to be focusing on the two that are on the left side here, woven fabrics and knitted fabrics. But this really, in an organized way, lays it all out for you so you can kind of see all of the different specific types of weaves that we're going to be getting into. Woven and knit fabrics differ in terms of basic construction. So the little chart here indicates how or where those differences come from. So woven fabrics are made with two or more sets of yarns that are interlaced at right angles. The vertical yarns are referred to as the warp, and the horizontal yarns are referred to as the weft. So you can see from this picture on the bottom here, and when you interlock those two, or you interlace those two yarns that way, it kind of creates like a checkerboard kind of thing. If you were to look at, let's say, for example, a t-shirt really closely, it would kind of resemble this type of woven pattern. So most garments like t-shirts, chambray shirts, that type of stuff would all be from fabrics that are woven. Knit fabrics are created via needles that form a series of interlocking loops from one or more yarns. So the types of garments that are manufactured in this way are sweaters and scarves, and some of you might actually have tried knitting before, be into it, or might even have a family member that has knitted you something, but that's done with needles. Now, as far as the types of yarns that are used for woven fabrics, the warp yarns, or the vertical yarns, are usually where the stronger yarns are placed. They tend to be a bit more uniform and have higher twist. And then the fancier yarns are used as sort of like a filler, and so those end up being used for the weft, or the horizontal weaving that takes place there. So those are the basic differences between the two types of fabric production we're going to talk about. In terms of the machinery used to weave fabrics, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the majority of the weaving was done by hand. And then as part of that revolution, the mechanized processes related to fabric making started to emerge, and the loom is one of those things. The picture on the left shows an older, we could say almost more traditional version of a loom. The picture on the right shows a more modern day version of it, and that's what most fabrics would be manufactured with today, or be woven with today. But this just kind of gives you an idea of the progression of the mechanized process that is now used to weave fabrics. If you remember from the chart in one of the very first slides of this presentation, the three types of weaves are plain, twill, and satin, and so we're going to look at those individually. First off, we're going to take the plain weave, which is the simplest of these three weaves. It's formed by the yarns being at right angles that pass alternately over and under each other. This is the least expensive weave to produce, and primarily because there's really not a whole lot of complexity to this design, if you want to call it. And as a result, the surface is a bit uninteresting, so hence the name, plain weave. But this type of weave is really good for printed designs and finishing that takes place later in the textile production process. So this weave sort of serves as a blank canvas for subsequent things that might be done to a fabric. But within this genre, there's the balanced plain weave, and that's when the warp and the weft yarns are the same size and the same distance apart. So that's about as basic as it possibly gets. The unbalanced or rib plain weave occurs when there are significantly more yarns in one direction than the other. So within the genre of plain weave, there is a large variety of fabrics, as you can see from the list here. So these are organized out by fabric type, and then I put the numbers of examples of these fabrics that are in your textile kit. So the first type here are the lightweight sheer fabrics, and those are going to have a bit more transparency, but they are also going to be quite light. So those are the chiffons, organzas, and those types of fabrics. The lightweight opaque fabrics still have that same quality of not being necessarily heavy, but they are a bit more opaque. So lawn and batiste fall under this category. The low-count sheer fabrics are fabrics like gauze and crinoline and cheesecloth, and those have actually other uses. A cheesecloth is used, for example, in cooking. Medium weight fabrics are those like your ginghams and chambrays, taffetas, and those types of fabrics, and they're going to have a bit more durability, and then, of course, even more so the heavyweight fabrics, which are fabrics like poplin, tweed, and burlap. Definitely take a look at each of these types of fabrics in your kit and go get a feel for it now that we've kind of started putting everything together as far as the different types of yarns and the fabrics. Go feel them all, feel the differences in weight and transparency in terms of being more opaque or less so, and that'll give you an experiential reference point for all of these different types of weaves. Basket weaving is done by including 2 or more warps and 2 or more fillings or wefts. So basically you're just kind of doubling up on the amount of yarn that goes into this weave, hence the name basket, because it kind of creates the look of a basket. Examples of this type of weave are the Oxford, the Ada cloth, Monk's cloth, canvas, and dimity, which the numbers of those are all in your kit, so you can go take a look at each type of basket weave. The second type of basic weave is the twill weave. And the twill is formed by, again, we're thinking about the warp and the weft, but now with the twill, each warp or filling floats across 2 or more of the warp or filling. So it's basically like the going over and under process is offset a bit and not as succinctly done each time. So what ends up being created by weaving in this way is a diagonal line within the fabric. It's a bit hard to see. It's more obvious on some fabrics than others, but and the direction of the diagonal determines whether or not it's a left or right hand twill. So here's some pictures of both types, and I put the arrows there just so you can kind of get an idea of which direction the diagonal is going in. You won't necessarily need to know that for an exam, again, because it's really, really hard to determine, but that is that is sort of the special characteristic of a twill weave. The neat feature about twill weaves is that you can get some really cool patterns just by virtue of the weaving of the fabric. So these are probably some patterns that you recognize: houndstooth, herringbone, and certainly denim. So these are all twill weaves. And within that genre, there are 2 types. There are even-sided twills and warp-faced. With even-sided twills, there's equal amount of warp and filling on either side of the fabric. So it looks really similar on both sides as a result of that. With warp-faced twills, there's a predominance of the warp yarns on the face of the fabric. So these are going to be more, these are like where denim falls into, and chino. The even-sided twills are where the houndstooth and the herringbone and surah and those types of fabrics fall into. So again, hopefully now you're able to classify some of those patterns that you've seen out there with respect to clothing before, and now you can identify the type of weave that is used to manufacture those fabrics. The third type of basic weave is the satin weave, and with this type of weave, each warp yarn floats over 4 filling yarns, or vice versa. So that's the reason why satins tend to be a little bit more lustrous, are because of the long floats that are on the surface. So basically there's these larger portions of the yarns that are exposed before they go back down into the weave again, so to speak. So the warp face satin is the more typical one, where the floats are in the warp direction, and then the filling face satin is when the floats are in the filling direction. But satins are used a lot in dresses, linings, lingerie, sheets, and draperies. But basically those items where that sheen or that lustrous surface is super important. You may have noticed a distinction between satin and sateen prior to this point, or at least heard of those two different terms. So now we can finally understand the difference between the two in talking about the weaves here. So satins are typically warp-faced, but they're primarily made of filament yarns to create more luster and shine on the surface of the fabric. So those are going to be the weaves that are made of rayon, polyester, acetate, and silk. This is in contrast to sateens, which are warp-faced or filling-faced, but those are primarily made of spun yarns, which creates a softer luster. The best way to see the difference between these two different weaves is just to look at the examples in your textile kit, and I've provided the numbers here for you. But you can see in sample number 91 that the sateen doesn't have anywhere near as much luster as, let's say, number 93 or number 90 that are satins. So the big difference is the luster that is created, and that comes from the type of yarns that are used, which, as we talked about last week, relates to the types of fibers that are used to make those yarns. So the filament fibers are from mostly the manufactured fibers, and then the spun yarns are from the more natural staple fibers. So cotton, for example, is used to make the sateen in number 91. So now you can kind of get an idea of the difference between satin and sateen. Now we're going to move on to chapter 13, and we're going to be talking about the fancier weaves. And you're going to notice that these weaves are a bit more interesting, a bit more decorative, and that's basically because there's just more production involved in these types of weaves, which also translates to higher cost. So, so the first one we're going to talk about is the Dobby weave. And for example, this weave is a bit more costly because it actually requires its own loom. So now we're getting just a bit more specialized here. Examples of the Dobby weave are the bird's eye. There's a picture of that here. The huckaback weave, which creates kind of that sort of raised, pebbly kind of surface, and waffle cloth. And there's an example of that, which is number 98 in your textile kit. So you can see that we're getting a bit more intricate and specialized now with the weaves, which results in just more interesting and, again, more decorative fabrics. Two additional fancy weaves are the extra yarn weave and the piqué weave. So the extra yarn weave results from additional warp or filling yarns of different colors woven into the fabric. And what it does is actually creates the pattern via weaving, as opposed to printing, which we're going to talk about a bit later. But so good examples of that are 99 and 100 in your textile kit. And you can see how, and actually if you look at the back of sample number 99, that sort of indicates the complexity that's involved in creating this fabric, because you can see how to create those little dots, all of the additional yarn that goes into the fabric in order to make that happen. And you can also detect that on sample number 101. It's not as obvious. I think it's a little bit harder to see on that one, but you can see how, as a result of extra yarn, whatever that pattern that you're seeing there is created that way. The piqué weave results in a raised effect that's similar to a quilt, and the fabric has some ridges. So examples of that are numbers 102 and 103, but again, you can see how that pattern that you can see there, for all intents and purposes, is actually created by the weave itself. Jacquard weaves are created from weaving that includes more than 25 warp arrangements. And jacquards actually require a special loom. They are done on a jacquard loom. But a lot of the like interior fabrics for furniture and that type of stuff is what jacquards are very often used for, just because of the size of a lot of the patterns as well. But examples of that are brocades, tapestries, damask. So you can go take a look at examples of that in your kit as well. But yes, most of the, or a great deal of the jacquard weave, or the fabrics resulting from jacquard weaves, are used in home furnishings. The mommy weave is also called the granite or crepe weave. It's not really characterized by any distinct weave effect per se, but the fabric has the appearance of being sprinkled with small dots or seeds. So the examples in your textile kit are numbers 108 and 109. So go take a look at those. You can see it easier in sample number 108 just because the color isn't, masking that look. But you can kind of see what I'm talking about there. It looks like it's sort of got some, and it even feels like it's got some like dots or kind of seed-like something on it. So again, this is a type of fancy weave. No real distinct weaving effects per se, but it does have kind of a cool look to it. Lino weaves are created when the warp yarns do not lay parallel to each other, but rather they work in groups. The picture is the best example of a lino weave. But this type of weave is used primarily for laundry bags, mosquito netting, that type of stuff, not really as much for clothing due to the, you could almost call it inconsistency throughout the fabric that's created from it. But you can see that the warp is more interlocked in certain areas and less in other areas. So again, which contributes to that inconsistency. Double cloth weaves are made from 3 or more sets of yarns, and because of this, the two sides of the fabric look different. So the face of the fabric looks very, very different from the back. Due to the addition of yarns, these fabrics are more expensive to produce. They do require special looms, and it's a slower production process overall. So again, you're talking just higher cost and higher effort in general. If you look at number 110 in your kit, that's true double cloth. This is where 5 sets of yarns are used, and that's primarily used for heavier apparel items such as coats and things like that. The double weave is sample number 111. That's where 2 sets of warp and filling yarns are used, and that is traditionally used in apparel and other upholstery fabrics. And then the double-faced weave you can see in number 112. That's where 3 sets of yarns are used, and that's primarily used for blankets and lining. But again, if you look at each of these, the backs are quite different from the faces of them, so that's sort of the major characteristic of the double cloth weave.
In this slide, we are looking at warp pile fabrics. Warp pile fabrics are made with 2 sets of warp yarns and 1 set of fill yarns. 1 set of warp yarns and the 1 filling yarn form the ground fabric, and the extra set of warp yarns forms the pile, and that pile can be cut or uncut depending on the end use of the fabric. Filling pile fabrics and warp pile fabrics are very different, and you can see a comparison of those 2 different types of weaves on page 323, figure 13.25. So you see the filling pile fabrics are made when the warp pile yarn is interlaced with the ground filling, and that will give you fabrics such as corduroy and velveteen. Those can be found in your fabric kit numbers 113 through 115. The warp pile fabrics are made when you take the filling pile yarn and it's interlaced with the ground warp. There you create fabrics such as velvet, which is in your fabric kit number 116, or terry cloth in your kit 117. So there you get a much thicker pile.
The last three types of weaves we're going to talk about here are slack tension, tapestry, and narrow fabrics. So the first type, slack tension weaves, is when the yarns on one beam are held at regular tension and those on the other are held at slack tension. And what that does is create a wave or sort of a crinkle effect that is usually associated with seersucker. So that's kind of the best example of that. And number 119 in your kit is a sample of seersucker fabric. Tapestry weaves are those that are hand-produced when discontinuous filling yarns are arranged to create whatever pattern the maker wants to create. So you don't have a sample of that in your kit, so I just put this picture of a tapestry weave for you. But again, that's going to be all of the hand-done stuff where the pattern sort of emerges as a result of the discontinuity going on there. Narrow fabrics encompass tapes, ribbons, zippers, trims, and everything else that is basically under 12 inches. So N44 through N52 in your kit gives you a wide range of those types of products. As a recap of what we talked about this week, we focused on fabrics that are woven as opposed to knitting, which we're going to talk about next week. We looked at the basic weaves of plain, twill, and satin weaves, and then we went into the fancy weaves, which was chapter 13, and that's where we talked about dobby weaves, piqué, jacquard, mommy, and slack tension, all those different fancy, more expensive and interesting weaves. So these are the takeaways from this week.
So here are the instructions for the weekly activity number 8. I hope that you have some fun with this assignment because we're going to be taking the fibers that we've been talking about and the fabrics and apply it to apparel. So what you're going to do is to review a collection of your choice from Fashion Week. I've provided some links for you. You're welcome to use whatever link you normally use to look at runway shows. You can choose the show of your choice, and then you will write a review of the show, at least 2 paragraphs. Tell us what the brand is that you reviewed and your favorite look or looks from the show, and then the fabrics that you think would work well for this in terms of fiber content and weave. It's best if you use your textile kit here. You may not know the exact fabric that they've used in the show, but you want to make your best guess in terms of the fabric or fabrics that they've used. You need to reference at least 4 swatches from your fabric kit that you think would either work well on these garments or that you think are the types of fabrics that are used from the runway show. So I'd like to see some creativity here from the runways, and I hope you have a lot of fun with this assignment. As the other assignments, it is also due Friday at 5 p.m. and I look forward to talking to you all next week.